Lochindorb is a shallow loch situated 20 miles north of the Cairngorm Mountains in Scotland. It's 2 miles long and nearly 1,000 feet above sea level, and for most of the year it is a bleak and wild place in the middle of expansive moorlands that lie just to the north of the lands of Badenoch. When the castle was built 750 years ago, this land was covered in dense natural forest that once stretched as far as you could see in all directions. The woodlands round the loch were highly prized hunting grounds of royals and the privileged. Back then, much of Scotland's forests had already been cleared for agriculture and building materials. Exactly when or why the trees here disappeared is not known, but there is evidence that some of it may have burned down. For a few months in the summer, on a bright day, the moorland north of the loch almost looks inviting, but I would not count on it. Wet and windy is more common, and winter conditions can be harsh. I have seen the loch frozen over and covered in deep snow. The ruins today are locally steeped in the myth of just one of its brief owners, the privileged son of a king who was gifted the castle nearly 100 years after it was built. He was a man who garnered a reputation that would later earn him the title the Wolfe of Badenoch, and still today Lochindorb and its castle is commonly referred to as the Wolf Slayer. I couldn't find any contemporary drawings or paintings showing what the castle originally looked like, but there are a few impressions reconstructing it. This one shows what can be determined from what remains. This one is more elaborate. I would suggest something between the two is likely. The castle was only occupied for about 180 years, but in that time it certainly had a colourful history. I could not even begin to tell but a part of it. The castle was built in the years around 1270 by the Comyn family, who were quite influential in Scotland at that time and had aspirations to the Scottish throne. William Wallace was born in 1270, and by 1298 a Scottish War of Independence was raging. The English king, Edward I, Wallace's bitter enemy, stayed at Lochindorb in 1303, and over the next few years extensive additions and rebuilding of the castle took place. Wallace was killed in 1305, and a year later Robert the Bruce had murdered John Comyn and raised the rebellion that would eventually gain independence for Scotland. In 1308 the Crown took ownership of the castle, and for nearly the next 30 years it passed between the state and the Earls of Moray. Scotland's independence was ratified in 1328 and King Robert died a year later. This is another reconstruction of what is thought to be the main entrance. By 1335, Scotland was again at war with England, and there were more bitter feuds amongst the Scottish clans who were vying for the throne. Bloody events led to Lochindorb Castle coming under military siege. It held out for 7 months until it was relieved by government troops. Modern archaeological works found a number of large granite stone balls that are believed to be the projectiles of a trebuchet. Next, a few years later, the castle became a state prison for 25 years, and there are reports of political prisoners dying of cold and hunger in its water pit dungeon. Then, in 1371, Robert the Bruce's daughter's son, Robert Stewart, became King of Scotland. He was the first Stuart king, King Robert II, and within a year he gave the lands and forests of Badenoch and the castle of Lochindorb to his own son, Alexander Stewart. History tells us that he became notorious throughout Badenoch and Moray as a cruel tyrant, murdering or imprisoning those who offended him, pillaging the countryside and robbing from wealthy churchmen. A long-time feud with the Bishop of Moray came to a head in 1390 when he set forth from Lochindorb and raided and burned much of the towns of Forres and Elgin, including many religious buildings, most notably the great and grand Elgin Cathedral. The pride of the kingdom, the lantern of the north, one of the largest cathedrals in Scotland. The Wolfe of Badenoch died 4 years later in 1394, the castle passing to his son. 50 years later, the castle had been inhabited for a time by the powerful Douglas family, who the then Stuart king perceived as a threat to his power, and so in 1455 Lochindorb saw the routing of another Scottish clan. A year later the castle was ordered dismantled because it was said that its position and strength posed a threat to royal power. The stones you can see here are believed to have been quarried and brought out to artificially enlarge the island. Even after partial demolition and 5.5 centuries of crumbling to greater ruin, much of the structure is still impressive. A translation of Lochindorb is Loch of Trouble.